Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this morning to our second session in this wānanga workshop series. I'm going to hand some time over to Ernest to give us the karakia.
Ka pai. Tēnā tātou katoa. Ngā iwi take I tā wahi. Koutou e noho mai ngā mō tere. Me tātou hoki putano ki te motu. Nō reira tēnā tātou katoa. Me huri tātou ki te kratia. E pā te matua. E hari ana te ngākau. Nā te mea, o tono mai ke koe tō tama ko tahi, kia kahore ngaro te tangata e whakapono no ki ai, engari kia whiwhi ai te oro tunutanga. Nō reira, e mohi ana, I tatu ana, o tae mai tō manakitanga I wainga nui a tātou. Nō reira, tahuri mai tō tarangi e tō tātou whakawhiti kōrero, kia u. Ko whakatōria mai I hoa ki a mātou te ara e haere. Ai mātou, te mea e mahi ai mātou. Na tohu I a mātou I a ngā mahi katoa kia tika, kia marika nei, mo tēnei wā. Ko koe hoki tō te tīmatanga, te mutunga ngai mā katoa, nō reira, whakamana mai tō tātou mahi, I runga ai te mohiotanga, e taunga tēnei, mo ngā whakatupuranga o te haere mai. E tino ngā kau tērā nou, e mahi ai mātou, I roto I te ingoa tēnei inoi, ai hukraiti tō tātou ariki. Amen.
Amene. Thank you, Matua Ernest. I'm just going to share my screen here. Lucy, can you let me know if you can see that on the screen? Great. Fantastic. Okay, so...
Hey, Ramona, you probably just want to switch the view around because we can see your notes.
Okay. Fantastic. Is that better? Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you much for Ernest for laying the whāriki for our hui this morning, our meeting this morning. And I want to acknowledge the esteemed collaboration partners, both local and international, on the session this morning, which are representing a diverse ecosystem of change. We hope you will join with us to become the educators on the topic of close to nature continuous cover forestry. This is an industry research collaboration led by the Connective in association with SCION, the New Zealand Forest Research Institute, Tane's Tree Trust, and Ngā Paua Tāne, the Māori Forestry Association. We also wish to acknowledge Te Ururako, the New Zealand Forest Service, who are the lead government agency for this project under the Forestry and Wood Processing Industry Transformation Plan. This is the second of 6 sessions in a wānanga or workshop series to build collective knowledge and agreement on CCF business models for Aotearoa New Zealand. All sessions are being recorded, and this session can be accessed from the registration website in a week's time. If you are texting me, can you stop that, because it's coming through on the microphone, and I'm not looking at text right now. Okay, so let's dive into this. So this is what our morning session looks like. Please note the speakers are building a complete picture for you. So to get the full picture, you'll need to consider all 3 presentations before we open up for questions and comments. If you have a question or a comment to make, please make use of either the chat function or the hands up emoji at the bottom of the screen. There will be 30 to 40 minutes of presentation time, followed by 30 to 40 minutes of audience discussion time. All going well, that is. Here are the guiding principles for our workshop, and these were determined by the collaboration partners in the weeks leading up to this Wānanga series. Here's a snapshot of who is in the room today. To kind of add another layer of richness to this, would be great if you were able to put your name, the group or organisation that you represent, and the country that you are dialing in from today. You can see there's a wide range of people. Okay, so recapping some of the main points from last week's session here on the screen. These were some of the main themes and points that came through from our discussions and our scene setting session last week. Our speakers today are going to help you to consider the new and perhaps reclaiming forces and influences that are converging around the push towards close to nature continuous cover forestry in Aotearoa, New Zealand in 2023. Some of these forces are being experienced in other countries across the world, and some of them are very local to Aotearoa. This sharing environment that we've created gives us a chance to step back and consider, contemplate, and perhaps even decide the values that we want this type of forestry to represent here in Aotearoa. What does that whole picture, the whole picture that these speakers are illustrating, mean for business models that we might design together that could embrace best practice here in the land of the long white cloud, Aotearoa. So, our first speaker, one of our up-and-coming leaders, Justice Heteraka, will talk on the constitutional beginnings of our nation and its relationship to the aspirations that are expressed in a Treaty of Waitangi Claim number 262. How does this particular context apply to close to nature continuous cover Indigenous forest systems here in Aotearoa, New Zealand? So I'm going to hand the time over to you now, Justice, for your presentation. Thank you.
Ata māori, everyone. Kia ora, Ramona. Thank you for that. E te tuatahi kia koe Papa Ernest. Nau I tūwhera tēnā kaupapa I raro I te koro ai wairua a tēnā koe. Kia koutou katoa ki ngā iwi taketake o te ao o tā wāhi tēnā koutou. E hui mai nei I tēnei ata. Kia ora koutou, ko Justice Heteraka tōku ingoa. Hiuri tēnei no te ākauroa o Ngātiwai, me ngā awatuna o Kaitahu. Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name's Justice. I am, I suppose, a child or a mokopuna of Y262 of this Waitangi Tribunal claim. And I suppose I've got a short period of time to talk about a kaupapa that is so huge and that so many amazing people have contributed to. And so I just want to, e te tuatahi, pay my respects to all of my tupuna who have come before me, who have sacrificed a lot of their life to push forward this kaupapa Awai 262. So before we get into this, I think it's really important that we kind of wind back a little bit and start at the very beginning. I suppose first, who am I? I have a legal background, and my main kaupapa is in education. So I run Ha, History of Aotearoa, and we develop and facilitate education programs. So we teach our local history, but we use our art to do that. So we use our mahi toi, going right back to our traditional methods of educating. And so alongside that, I'm part of this Wai262 kaupapa, and the main essence of the kaupapa is to restore te mana motuhake me te rangatiratanga o ngā taonga katoa me ngā mātauranga Māori. So that's to restore the ultimate sovereignty of te ao Māori, of our rangatira, in relation to all of our taonga. So all things that are special to us, things that are tangible, our treasures, for example, our taonga species, our flora and fauna, and all of the bodies of knowledge, the indigenous knowledge systems connected to those taonga. So yeah, I'll remind myself to clarify some Māori words if I go in and out. But i te tuatahi, so I want to take it right back to 1835 and 1840, so to the constitutional foundation of Aotearoa, of our country. So Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which I hope most of us are familiar with to some degree, is one of our founding documents. And it was an exercise of our rangatiratanga, or our chiefly authority and mana, to, I suppose, restructure our constitutional organisation. And so in he whakaputanga, which was a declaration of independence 5 years before Te Tiriti o Waitangi, it stated that here in Aotearoa, we have our own system of governance, we have our own laws, our own tikanga, and those laws, those tikanga, are directly connected to the environment. And so our genealogy takes us right back to our Earth Mother, so Papa Tuanuku, and all of our atua, our gods, that make up this world, the cosmos that we're connected to. And so after the Declaration of Independence came Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And so our chiefs noticed a lot of lawlessness going on by the new European settlers. And so they said, all right, Crown, come and govern your own people, they said. And so in our structure of, in our governing structure in 1840, we had rangatira, or chiefs, who took care of the safety of their people. So we had lots of different chiefs across the country, lots of rangatira across the country, and they held their own rangatiratanga and mana, their decision-making powers, their own rightful authority over their people and their environment, most importantly. So they negotiated the relationship between people and environment to keep us safe, and also to manage our use and our use of the environment. And so when Te Tiriti o Waitangi was signed, the intentions of our tupuna was that the Crown would come and join that constitutional arrangement. So they would become one chief of a group of people, so the new settlers in Aotearoa. And so that was a great constitutional document that brought together a partnership of two ways of being, of two cultures, and of two laws. So of two cultural bodies of knowledge around the way we interact with each other and the way that we as humans interact with our environment. So if that is our foundation, we'll start with that very, very briefly. And And so after that, we have, up until now, the years of colonization, I suppose. And so from there came the legal and often violent dispossession of Māori from their land, and the legal outlawing, I suppose, of access to resources in the ngahere, in the forest, in the ocean. Our people were not only taken from their land, removed from their land, but that meant that they were taken from their social structures. So they couldn't practice their laws in relation to their land and their resources. They were stripped away access from their rongoa, so their medicinal practices, spiritual and medicinal practices, which meant a loss of knowledge around those things. So I suppose it's a progressive, colonization was a progressive force. So once you're taken from your land, you no longer have access to your resources, you cannot sustain your people, you cannot keep your people well, and then you lose the body of knowledge connected with all of those practices, which essentially means you lose your culture and identity. And so if we are starting with that background, we get to Y262. So Y262 was a Waitangi tribunal claim, the 262nd tribunal claim, which I suppose was one tool that these claimants, so these are the 6 claimants here, of the 6 different iwi, including Kataraina Rimini at the bottom there from Ngāti Kahungunu. These people were visionaries, and they were fierce protectors of their way of life and of their environment. And so they put forward to the tribunal that the Crown has breached Te Tiriti o Waitangi because they have absolutely removed our ability to practice our culture and remain, I suppose, possession and also control and authority over our resources. So Y262 is known as the flora and fauna claim, or the intellectual property claim. And so in Article 2 specifically of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, it said that we would maintain Te Tino Rangatiratanga, so that ultimate decision-making authority over ngā taonga katoa. And so, as I mentioned earlier, ngā taonga katoa includes the tangible taonga, measures, the knowledge, indigenous epistemology and knowledge systems connected to those taonga. And so the 6 claimants, here we have some of the examples of taonga that they used in the tribunal claim. And so, here, these are very, very specific examples. And in the claim, they spoke to their relationship to each of those taonga and the way the Crown has legally and illegally taken away their right to exercise their laws in relation to these taonga, and how that has led to a loss of knowledge and a loss of identity in relation to those taonga. So I suppose, so when you have a tribunal claim, I'm trying to keep it as concise as I possibly can. When you have a tribunal claim, you usually have a settlement or some form of redress, and that's often in a fiscal sense, although our people never agreed to it being fiscal, because the most important thing was our relationship with the land and our relationship with our resources. And so Y262 is different to other treaty settlement claims in the sense that we're not necessarily looking for a monetary settlement. What we want and what we're looking for, and the only thing that will redress the harm done by the Crown in this space, is constitutional transformation. And so constitutional transformation, and as transformative as our tupuna, as our ancestors were in 1835 and 1840, we can continue to be transformational in the way we relate to each other and we relate to the environment. And so in order to achieve constitutional transformation, there are a few pathways we can go down. So there's the decolonization. So decolonization and re-indigenization can lead to constitutional transformation. So at the end of the day, a constitution is something that governs the way, are the laws and rules that govern the way we relate to each other and the way we relate to the environment. And so, yeah, we had a system, we had tikanga, we had laws that governed our behavior in that aspect. And we also have laws now that govern our, I suppose, constitutional framework. But we as people every day and in all of our spaces can choose the laws and the tikanga, or the ethics, I suppose, in which we negotiate our relationship with the environment. So here on the decolonization side, we have in the Y260 space something called Te Aki Taonga. So our legal experts, our academic technicians are currently working on a Te Aki Taonga framework. And so that is a tikanga-based framework that can help the Crown, its agencies, and all non-Māori entities in negotiating their relationship with our taonga. So with our taonga species, with our taonga works, with our designs, our patterns, and the IP connected to it. And so essentially that pathway, or that that framework that's being created, can help and guide you in the way you relate to and with tangata whenua, so the people of this land and their bodies of knowledge. And so on the re-indigenizing side, it's, I suppose, the other aspect, and that's our need, and at the moment, the momentum that's growing for people to re-indigenize their minds. And so coming back to the laws and the tikanga that used to guide our people in this world and their relationship with our environment. So we have a huge resurgence of knowledge. We have a huge resurgence of Indigenous knowledge coming back into the forefront. And so we have our children relearning what it looks like to look after our flora and fauna in an Indigenous way. And we have our kaumātua and our tohunga, our elders and our highly specialized specialist practitioners in relation to the environment, teaching again the knowledge. So when we have these two things moving at the same time, the more we connect with tangata whenua and mātauranga Māori, so the people of this land, and the knowledge systems connected to that old way of being, we can all start to embrace a different way of relating to the environment. So there is this resurgence happening, which is really exciting. And for me, in my experience with Te Taia, with our world and Te Aotearoa and this environment we live in, it has been absolutely powerful to reconnect with the whenua, so to reconnect with the land and the ocean, and all of the taonga that exists, because here we sit as taina, so we sit as the younger siblings of the environment. And so how do we negotiate that relationship is the question. And so in relation to continuous cover forestry, I think it's really important for everyone in this space to consider, one, what is your relationship with the people of the land you're working on? So what does that relationship look like? What is the aspirations of the people connected to that land? And are you ready? This is, I suppose, a challenge or a widow that I'm putting to you all. are you ready to allow Indigenous knowledge to lead in this space? Because at the end of the day, we are in a rapidly changing climate, as we know, a rapidly changing climate, and Indigenous knowledge will help guide us to navigate these changes. So yeah, I suppose my question and my widow through all of that is, are you ready? Are you ready to let Indigenous knowledge lead? And if so, take up the challenge. Go for it. I think connection and relationship is the key. So if we go back to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the partnership was between two ways of seeing the world, two laws, two cultural laws coming together. It wasn't just about the partnership between two cultures. It was the partnership between the ways of being. And so if we can bring together the best of both of our cultures for the betterment of not only Aotearoa, but most importantly for the betterment of our whenua and our environment, then we can make some powerful, powerful change. Ka tira, I think I've rambled on for my time limit today. I tried to keep it as concise as possible, but yeah, if there's any questions later, please let me clarify if I need to. No reira,
thank you. How you truncate 182 years of history into 10-15 minutes, that's a skill. Thank you very much. Te tirohanga, which you see on the screen here, means the outlook. What does it look like from here? So thank you so much, Justice, for doing justice to that kōrero and to the challenge and the challenge and the wero that we're hoping people will pick up. Thank you so much. So moving on to our next speaker, Roger Dungan will talk today on the influence of climate, another strong force taking place here in Aotearoa and across the world. And he's going to talk about the influence of climate and our relationship with others in the global climate emergency. Over to you, Roger.
Kia ora, Ramona. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much. It's nice to see you all, and a shout out to you, Justice. I was feeling a little bit of pressure to try and summarize things really succinctly, but I think what you had to carry on your back to summarize in 10 minutes was a bit more weighty, so good on you. That was a really good introduction. Kind of in a similar vein, this is very much context. And Ramona, if you can flick to the next slide there. What I'd quite like to leave you with is kind of four key points. And so I've come at this from my background in international negotiations. As the little intro said at the start, I spent a while working at MFAT. I was part of our climate change negotiating team. I was in the room when the Paris Agreement was agreed. To be fair, I was right down the back, but I was there. So I feel like I've got a little kind of connection back into that. But a lot of my work has been really looking at the international context and what that means for Aotearoa New Zealand and our domestic policy, and trying to really protect and promote our interests internationally. I started off as a forest scientist, so I can nerd out with the foresters and talk about forest management a wee bit, even though they're the experts, and likewise on the international climate change stuff, I can nerd out with those guys. But it's such a complicated area of work that other people than me now have the expertise, because I've stepped back from that. So a little bit like you, Justice, I'm trying to kind of bring their voices in here, but conscious that some bits of expertise are with others. So the four key points that I thought would be quite useful to give us a bit of context for this kōrero are that just a little reminder about what the international context is in terms of climate change, what our international climate change commitments look like, and a reminder of our domestic climate change commitments too, and a real sort of key point that those are actually a little bit different, and a reminder of what those look like. But a key message is part of that, and really, which is I think the starting point for my involvement here, is that forests are a fundamentally important part of both of those things, both for us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in other parts of the world as well. So the work that we're all thinking about in terms of how we manage our forests more effectively sits really strongly in that broader international context of how we are all working together as a global community, fundamentally to help save the world. So this is a real grounding of that. Second key point, and I won't get into the detail too much on this because I know, again, there's other people on this call who have better expertise than me on this, is that forestry and the way we manage our forests in New Zealand is kind of different. We've got ourselves into a situation that's probably not quite the right word, but where we find ourselves now is quite different to other places, and it really relates a lot to the kinds of things that Justice was talking about as well. It's fundamentally, in my view, rooted in the post-colonial history of Aotearoa New Zealand and how we collectively have interacted with the environment here, how our worldview about how we use resources has impacted on how we manage our forests and how we get to where we are now. Third key point, and this is a key one to remind ourselves of, because right at the moment, and I don't need to tell the New Zealanders on this call, this next point, we're really talking a lot about forestry and the emissions trading scheme at the moment. And it's a key driver of a lot of thinking around forests, forest management, the future of forestry in New Zealand. But it's important to remember that the ETS, in terms of forestry, isn't everything, even though it really sometimes feels a lot like it is. And the final point to walk away with is that a problem in Aotearoa New Zealand is not that we've got too much forest, and not that we're not planting enough, it's that we're not doing enough other things. And this relates back to both the ETS and our national and international commitments around climate change. And it perhaps picks up a little bit of the system change points that Justice was talking about as well. We've got a big problem. We're doing a little bit about it, but we're really struggling on some of the big crunchy issues that are going to have to make big progress if we are serious about our climate change commitment. So it's a little reminder that we talk a lot about forest and forestry, and the framing and the discourse at the moment is a little bit like forestry is a problem, but let's not forget there's all this other stuff that we have to do, which is even more challenging, and we're not really talking about that quite as much. Final little point, forestry, international climate change, ETS. She gets really complicated really fast. So there's a little kind of, if you feel overwhelmed with forestry stuff, don't panic. Thanks, Rona. So the first key point to kind of frame us in terms of international climate change and the climate change commitments we've got is just a little reminder about what our international climate change commitments are. We've signed up, along with 190 however many other countries, to the Paris Agreement. And as part of that, we have submitted our nationally determined contribution, which is really saying what we as a country are going to be doing to contribute to action to try and keep the global temperature rise well below 2 degrees. And everyone is saying it's got to be below 1.5 degrees. And we know just how much of a challenge that is, given the global temperature trajectory is now. So what we've said we'll do is to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions to 50% below gross 2005 levels by 2030. And unpicking those words to understand exactly what that means is super challenging, because we've got net reductions and gross. It gets hard. But basically, by 2030, we've got to reduce our emissions, net emissions 50% below gross 2005 levels in the next sort of 6 years. And based on our most recent greenhouse gas inventory, this roughly equates to 571 million tonnes of CO2 reductions over that 9-year period since when we put our NDC in. Now, I don't need to tell this group that the challenge of reducing gross emissions is a big one for New Zealand. We're really going to struggle with that. Not just everyone does, because fossil fuels are cheap and abundant, and they have fueled the economic transformation that the world has seen over the last 250 years. So changing that's going to be really hard. We've got quite a unique emissions profile, particularly in the land use sector. Again, don't need to tell anyone on this table just how much of our emissions come from agriculture. So land use is absolutely fundamental to all of this. Second key point to remember is our domestic climate change target, and that is enshrined at the moment anyway in our Climate Change Response Act. And under that nationally binding law, we've said that by the 1st of January 2050 and every subsequent year, and I've added that in italics because a lot of people forget this, it's not just by 2050, but it's by 2050 and then from everywhere else. Net zero emissions of all greenhouse gas other than biogenic methane. Key point, we've got the split gas target. And for methane, you can read it there, 24 to 47% reduction below. Geez, it gets so complicated, climate change. We've got to reduce methane emissions. It's really hard. It's a little bit different to the rest of us. And that's, you can read it there. So we've got those key things, but the fundamental bit here is the bit in italics. It's by the 1st of January and every year thereafter. So it's not just 2050, it's what happens next. So we've said we're going to do this through emissions budgets. They're set by the government based on advice from the Climate Change Commission. And hopefully you would have seen sort of back in April through June, the Climate Change Commission was consulting on its next lot of advice to the government on what those climate change budgets should look like. And if you read those documents, forestry was a really big part of that, particularly how that interacts with the ETS and what that does in terms of our gross emissions reductions efforts. And hopefully some of you put your submissions in and shared your thoughts. We at Scion did as well. And what that means currently anyway, oh, sorry, can you just flip back one there for a minute? Tracking the whip on the timing, that's good. So you can see that the budget's there. At the current budget period, our net emissions have got to be 72.5 million tonnes of CO2, and you see that's trending downwards year on year over the next sort of 10 years or so. So by the period 2031 to 2035, we're expecting to be making quite some big reductions. That'll get us on a pathway to net zero by 2050. And at the moment anyway, it's important to remember forests currently move about a third of our total gross emissions, or decently over half of our non-agriculture emissions. So forests and forestry are a really key part of what our domestic climate change response needs to look like. So now go, click. The other key point that I wanted to just remind ourselves of is that New Zealand forestry is globally anyway, it's a bit of an outlier. Our forests and forest systems and how we manage them look really different to how they do in lots of other places. So how we think about forests and forestry can look quite different to how other countries do. And why that's important in terms of international context is the international rules are negotiated by agreement among 190 however many different countries, most of whom do things that look really different to us. So it can be quite hard for us as a country and our voice to be heard. And like I said, and sort of as Justice alluded, a lot of that is really a reflection of our recent human history. We've got, roughly speaking, 10 million hectares of forest left now. It used to be a lot more than that. Then, hey, agriculture came and we cut and burned down a fair chunk of our forests, and we don't have as much left as we used to. It's give or take around about 37% of our total land area. It used to be a lot more than that. Of that, roughly at the moment, 7.9 million is indigenous forest, and it's currently mostly in Crown ownership. The rest is mostly exotic plantations, and that's mostly not Crown owned. Production forests are mostly one species managed in one way, and as we know, that's mostly, let's not get into detail, it's mostly Pinus radiata, fantastic species. It's a super tree, does amazingly. It's transformed New Zealand. It's managed mostly in one way. We all know Clearfield Forestry, it has done us really well as a sector. But what we've got now is a situation where indigenous forestry is almost exclusively for conservation. We don't get very much economic extraction value out of our indigenous forests because of its, the history of conservation and clear felling, and the fact that indigenous trees, we didn't manage them well over quite a long period of our recent history. We didn't really appreciate the challenges in sustainably managing those forests, and as a consequence, we were extracting them and harvesting them much faster than they were regrowing. We needed an alternative. We looked overseas. We found amazing, fast-growing exotic species, which helped build our economy, gave us the timber that we need to physically build our houses and cities. Without them, New Zealand would look quite different. But exotic forests are mostly for production. We have this really strange dichotomy. And it's really different to how most other countries do it. Most other countries are using exotic forests in a whole wider range of management regimes than we do here. And this is a really key one for us as we're thinking about continuous cover forestry, even if it's not something that we do a lot of in terms of our productive forest management in New Zealand. Other places do. So we shouldn't be afraid or weirdly weirded out by the concept of continuous cover forestry. It's not something we do a lot of here, but heaps of other people do. So let's not worry too much about it. It is something that we can pick up and run with. And really the international rules around forestry and climate change reflect this. Let's not get into the detail, but just a little reminder that once again, we're a little bit out on our own. The way we do things is quite different. The rules around forestry, how that relates to climate change, reflects that as well. Right, got to hurry up. Next slide, go. So another key point, ETS isn't everything. It feels like it is because that's all we hear about at the moment, but it's not. It's not everything. And let's just remind ourselves of why that is. Rules for accounting for forestry emissions are based, like I say, on these international rules. Kyoto Protocol, IPCC, again, don't get into the detail. Broadly speaking, we divide forest into two types, those that were established before 1990, those that were established after 1989, and that pre-1990, post-89 terminology even trips me up myself. Now it gets confusing. Key point, post-1990 forests are broadly speaking outside of the emissions trading scheme. There are some nuances there, but we include them in our national accounting, really important for our international commitments. Post-89 forests can be in the ETS, but they don't have to be. And if we flick to the next slide, here's why that's important. So of our 2.1 million hectares of planted forest, most of that, 1.4 million hectares, is pre-1990. And of the post-89 forests, only 77% is in the ETS, which means only about 25% of all our exotic forestry is registered into the ETS. So it's 25% of our exotic forest estate, broadly speaking, in the ETS, the rest of it isn't. 86% of it is exotic, again, mostly Pinus radiata, and most of it, 90%, is in land use capability classes 6 and above. So it's unsuitable for arable production, pasture, but not for growing crops. And most of that land use is either at moderate or severe risk of erosion under pasture. And again, sort of linking back to the stuff that Justice was talking about, the way that we find ourselves managing the land now really strongly relates to the history of how we've got to where we are. So we cleared most of our forest, especially on hill country, we converted it to pasture. That's created problems, and in some parts of the country, we know that that's created much stronger problems than it has in other, particularly around erosion, soil conservation, how we get forest back onto the land, particularly in those parts of the country, is going to be really important. And the fact that we've got so much of our post-89 forest in those more susceptible land use classes is a real key reminder of that. And the final point to leave us with is our problem isn't that we have too much afforestation. I would say it's we don't have enough. And one of the key reasons why I say that is if we look at our emissions reduction plan, carbon uptake and storage by forests needs to double by 2035. So we need a lot more forest, and we need it to be growing really quickly in order to help meet our climate change targets. That forest has got to support a much greater range of uses than it does now, and we see that in the response to the cyclones, particularly in Tairāwhiti and Wairoa. We've got to be focusing much more on sustainable land use writ large, and that's a challenge not just for forestry, but let's face it, for agriculture as well. We know we need to be supporting the twin, or solutions to the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity. We need much greater focus on biodiversity management in our forests. And this is a thing that's really core to our hearts at Scion, using our forests as a feedstock for a circular bioeconomy. We need to be making more things out of our forests, whether that's biofuels, bioplastics, the kinds of things that we currently use fossil fuels for, we can make out of timber, but we need to be using our forests much more. We can't just think of them in terms of a carbon stock. We need to be moving much more to use of those forests. Sorry, that comment's just jumped up onto my screen. Yeah, we need much more diversity in our forest estate. At the moment, and again, don't need to tell you guys this, we've got heaps of forest in Pinus radiata. We need more diversity to help with climate, resilience, disease resistance, more productive uses, that kind of stuff, and managed in ways that are quite different to how they are now. Again, there will be places where what we do now is perfect, let's not change it. There will be other places where it's not, and we need to be much more focused on that. And the final little point here is that the longevity of the forest is more important than the longevity of the trees. We've got to keep them as forests, And as foresters and forest managers, we're comfortable with the idea that you can cut trees down and use them for things. That's why who we are and what we do. But we need to do that differently. And again, continuous cover forestry, even though we don't do a lot of it now, important in other places. Let's learn and think about how we can use our forests in different ways. Sorry, that was a real whistle-stop tour of global context, echoing some of the stuff Justice was saying, and hopefully that'll set us up to hear from someone who knows much more about actual forest management than me, and I'll let Ramona introduce him. Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Again, truncating a massive, huge topic of conversation and relevance into 10, 15 minutes. Thank you so much, Roger. You did a great job. So I'm going to now introduce our last speaker, Kit Richards, and he's going to talk about the historical journey of continuous cover forestry in New Zealand and internationally, and why looking back for a reality check around forests must help us to inform a newer, better, more collaborative and resilient set of models going forward. Kit is from the old school of continuous cover forestry and has weathered some of the ups and downs of this type of forestry in New Zealand for some time now. Over to you, Kit.
Morena, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity, and this will be another whistle-stop tour in two halves. I will cover very briefly and probably most inaccurately something of the history in New Zealand, and then focus more on what are some of the current barriers to why CCF hasn't taken off in a New Zealand context, because if we can understand what some of those barriers are, then hopefully there's an opportunity to consider how you overcome those barriers. Thank you. Next one.
I don't know if you can hear us. You're on mute.
We've lost you. We've lost your sound.
Right.
There we go. You're back.
Yeah. So historically, there was research going on into continuous cover systems. I haven't looked in detail at the history books and the dates are probably wrong, but certainly right through from the 50s onwards, scientists were looking at, is there a better way to do this in our native forests as they were. Those generally were thwarted. A combination of the ecology of the species concerned, our available technology, economics of the day, which were primarily governed by still either clearance or provision of timber resources for a developing post-war New Zealand, and the policies around that. But there was a general progression that led finally through to the 1980s, 1982, I think, when all forest harvest in North Island Crown Forest ceased, through 87, when the West Coast Accord set a timetable for clear fell cessation on the West Coast forests, and also hopefully the beginnings of a process towards continuous cover forestry. And then in 1993, Part 3A of the Forest Act came into force, aiming to control and push forward for continuous cover forestry on private land. Okay, next one. So looking at Part 3A, as stated, the objective was to restrict natural forest harvest on private land, move it towards continuous cover. It required the two pathways to achieving that objective, either through the development of management plans, which were generally aimed at larger estates, or the concept of larger estates managed over extended periods of time, and also permits, which were really a mechanism and very much a compromise, I suspect, to enable small private landowners to get a bit of cash today or tomorrow, and providing they didn't do anything more on the forest for an extended period of time, then everyone supposedly was happy. Fairly questionable success on a number of fronts. Permits outnumbered plans by a minimum ratio of 3 to 1. In other words, most people gravitated for various reasons to going for permits. The plans were dominated by those who had access to beech forest, mainly because of the extent and at that time perceptions of easier management for a long-term program. And the permits were mainly non-beech species and mainly in the remnant forests of the North Island. And the graphs there just show some of the detail around that. I'm not sure whether these are going to be made available to other people. If I'm assuming they are, so I won't go into the detail. People can interpret that themselves. Next. So the purpose of the West Coast Accord, that was to see the cessation of clearfell and for a remaining margin of the forest to move towards a continuous cover forestry basis. And the slide on the left-hand side was really showed the dichotomy that New Zealand was in at the time, where in 1986, we had our major reforms in New Zealand. We went to formalise that separation of conservation versus purely commercial production. And over the period of 11 years that this slide represents, the whole point of the Accord was to try and actually go against that current and move things back into a more integrated form. And I put that slide up because that was a slide I did back in 1997. So that's where we were then. Next one. So by the end of the 1995, we had continuous cover forest was underway on a large scale on an 8,000 hectare estate, but with plans for development of the same techniques within beech forests on the West Coast. That was all, as people will be aware, curtailed by the government because it was Crown land in 2002. There were further efforts, including myself, to develop the similar techniques on small areas of private land, and those were written up by FOA as an example of efforts to achieve exemplary management. And since then, we've had a few remaining players continuing, the biggest being the Southland Silver Beech, and then other small providers, but they are very small in the bigger picture. Thank you. Next one. So the big question, why hasn't it taken off? And I will race through these, some of these fairly quickly. Next one. So one of the issues that we have to understand is, of course, this, the barriers are determined by what people's objectives are and whose objectives. And coming in, influencing a party's objectives are such things as land value and the way we value land in New Zealand, including economically. Land ownership, is the land owned by multiple parties, Māori land, for instance, and what does that do in relation to a single private owner or a corporate owner? Their objectives can be very different for different reasons. There's issues of land fragmentation or the size of the estates that are available or how you coordinate them if they're small. And then there's obvious things like personal benefit, how that's perceived, institutional benefit, which will often be naturally very, very different, to personal benefit. If you're managing money on behalf of other people or resources on behalf of other people, that can be very different to if you're managing your own resource and what you see as your objectives. And then the big one, which we're all confronting at the moment, is the matter of societal benefits and where those fit into the picture. Technology and markets are, of course, the tools that enable all this, if you've decided on objectives, to come together, but they are really secondary. We can develop technology and we can develop markets and sometimes be successful, sometimes not. Okay, next one. I thought it was very important. Now, this is a huge generalization, but it's still very, very important, and it touches a wee bit on Roger's comments as well. Comparing what we have here in New Zealand with what's happened overseas, many of the forests overseas that are under continuous cover are their native forests. They're already in existence. So the forest capital is already present. You're not having to grow it. Often that land has been on public land in very large parts of the world, or some subset of public land. There are advantages, obviously, of being close to large markets, including large domestic or near domestic markets, and often government assistance and subsidies have been available, particularly in the EU. Many of the countries also have a long history of human occupation and war, and this has led to establishment of infrastructure just by default of people being present for long periods of time. And access infrastructure plays a huge role in assisting the development of continuous cover forests. The comment about war is because in large parts of Europe there is extensive roading networks, and much of that arose from World War II in particular, and the need to get through forests to get to various conflict zones. They also have highly organised cooperative systems, particularly in Scandinavia and other parts of the world, to support that process of aggregating the interests of small players. Next one. So just looking at how some of these barriers play out. The graph on the left-hand side is exactly the same costs as the graph on the right-hand side. One on the left represents an existing forest, one on the right represents New Zealand's standard issue, where we're taking some bare land and planting a forest. And really all we're trying to show here is that if the forest is existing, you may have costs that are incurred in trying to manage it, but you don't need a lot of extra margin over and above to make what would be regarded as a satisfactory return to keep the operation going, pay for all the people involved, and so on. As soon as you have a situation where you're growing a forest and you have to wait many years for that forest to develop, you have the problem of interest and accumulating interest under our current economic structures as we operate in most parts of the world. And that means you need an awful lot more money for the same hectare of land of species to be able to cover the costs and make what would conventionally be regarded as a acceptable return on the money you've put in. Okay, next one. We also have a problem, again, with interest in conventional economics with the species, and it determines why so consistently we have settled as a country on radiata pine. Basically, the longer the rotation, if you're having to grow the forest from a start point, then the longer it takes to grow that species, then the more and more value per hectare or per tree that you need to be able to get the same economic result. And if you're managing a forest on behalf of other people and using their money, then this thing called NPV, net present value, becomes highly relevant. And it has the yellow curve has a very steep drop off as time goes on. again, accumulating interest. So when we talk about high value, we need to be very aware of what we actually mean. High value at a unit of wood may well be achievable, but if you're having to grow that crop from zero, that value rapidly diminishes over time. It's standard economics. It may not be something we want, and it may be something we have to consider how you change, but that is the orthodoxy of the world at the moment. So it does not favour well other species. So we also have, some reasonably interesting physical geography and developing climatological problems. The photo on the right-hand side is in the Austrian Alps, and I've been in Austria a couple of times looking at some of what they do, and we often see that as an example. They're on fairly steep land, but by and large, despite the massively steep backdrop in the Austrian Alps there, the land that they are doing, it might be steepish, but it is not as steep and dissected as broken as many parts of New Zealand. And that is an enormous benefit to being able to implement continuous cover forestry. They also, and certainly as is the case in the picture here, are often on somewhat more stable geologies. Yes, they do have big storms. Yes, they have floods. Yes, they have debris flows. But the underlying geology is still quite often somewhat better. If it's not as good, they put it into total protection. In New Zealand, we cleared land. We found we'd made a bit of a mistake. We said, we have a solution, let's bang radiata on it. That's worked very well until we come to harvest, and particularly in the face of increasing storm events and the severity of those storms and the expectation that that's going to get worse, we now have a problem. Next one. The simplicity of this is, I'll let you deal more or consider it more later, but basically scale is enormously important. I've just got 3 pictures there that you can go from simple to much more technologically advanced. The costs involved go up massively, and you can apply exactly the same sort of sequence to processing as well, from just a few logs in a farm yard, backyard somewhere, to a proper modern sawmill. Costs escalate massively. It's all about getting the scale matched between those technologies and to the forest you're trying to manage and the extent of the forest you manage. Get it wrong and you lose money very, very quickly in big quantities. Next one. And again, yes, you can use smaller machinery to do things in plantation forests, and you can get equipment, and we would be able to get equipment that would, if you like, de-intensify some of our operations that would be required if we're going to some form of continuous cover. But and those could be competitive if they were operating at their maximum with some of our much more productive and intensive operations. But as soon as you move back and de-escalate the scale to continuous cover type systems, then the costs do go up, and you need to be aware, and anyone who's trying to entertain that need to be very aware of the cost curves that are going to be involved. Next one. This is quite complex. I'll let people try and interpret that if they get a chance to look at it themselves. All we're trying to illustrate here is that in trying to develop a market for new species, and this was produced for the previous conference on continuous cover forestry and forestry in general, developing a new market for other timbers in this country in a very small domestic market requires some pretty good information, some pretty good analysis, and a recognition as part of that analysis that you are going to have to understand, can you be substituted by other technology applying to wood, including radiata? Will you get going and then be substituted by imports? Or can you, particularly if you can add some more cultural meaning, develop a domestic market? And if you're really lucky, have enough scale to develop an export component that actually means something to other people in the world. Lots of unknowns, very difficult to penetrate. Next one. Simple here, again, let people read it themselves. Basically, the move from small scale to large scale basically is worlds apart. And that is one of the big issues that people will have to contemplate if they're trying to implement something, for a whole host of reasons, some of which are listed there, but it is very different process in the supply chain to go from small to large. Next one. Okay, so I guess summing up, can it be done at scale? Because that's, I think, what people are looking for. The answer is technically probably can be, but with a lot of work, preferably more amenable landforms, which is a problem in New Zealand because we end up in land competition between pastoral agriculture and forestry. It will need a coalescence of the willing and motivated people. And to break down some of the current barriers, ecosystem services are going to almost certainly have to play a significant part in that process, as they do overseas. That's why in some parts of overseas, very low returns are actually accepted, because the public want other services from the forests, and they expect them, but they also recognise they must pay for them. And in New Zealand, we're rather poor at coming to that recognition, and we only need to look at the debate around carbon as an ecosystem service and the current political debate, and we are a long, long way yet from accepting that as an ecosystem service. So the final point, I guess, is if we're looking for large-scale or transition of existing plantations, emphasising the existing component, then under current orthodoxy, in some, if not many situations, there would probably be a requirement for substantive write-downs of the value to the people who planted them or bought them. It may require incentive payments, it may require ecosystem service payments, or it may require infrastructure subsidies, if you like, for infrastructural capital investments to get the access set up to enable continuous cover to work into the long term. So there's a whole complexity of things that are going to have to be considered, which will be a very strong challenge to orthodoxy, to our political structures at the moment, and to our cultural background, which I think back to a statement I think Peter Berg made last week, which was the early statements from the Commissioner of Crown Lands that a blade of grass was worth a tree or several trees or something of that nature. So they're big societal changes that will be required. I think that's it from me.
Wow. And a perfect end to the presentations, Kit. You've posed some of the key questions that we're all on here to help answer or resolve moving forward in terms of a more enabling environment. What does that look like? And informed by experience and a very strong and committed pathway or personal life commitment, sorry Kit, to this area of continuous cover forestry. I would say that there are not many people in this country that understand to the same degree what is in the way of making this type of forestry work. But thank you very much for your time and for putting in that effort. I'm going to open up now to the floor for some questions. I've got some questions on here. And I'm going to refer, Brad, you've dominated the questions in the chat room there. I'm going to ask you to pick one of those questions or statements and unmute yourself for kicking off our discussion this morning.
Cool. Kia ora tātou. Thanks, Marona. I was just thinking, Roger, great talk, mate. Just thinking, yeah, like there's definitely a massive emphasis on more trees in the ground, and I do acknowledge that is part of the solution. And I just think, like, as a country, we need to like be more innovative and come up with a whole breadth of options to not only meet our obligations, but to also, as a small country, influence the bigger, massive emitters as well. That was all I was really getting at.
That's great. Thanks, Brad. Brad, of course, represents Tasman Regional Council, which is at the top of the south of our South Island, and is engaged in this work on a daily basis, and all of those dreaded permits that were spoken of earlier. I can see Frank Strayer, do you want to put a question to the group or make a brief comment? Frank is from Tasmania, in Australia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for letting me be part of this process. I think you are doing amazing work to have this conversation. It's obviously intergenerationally concentrated, and I like to recommend that you will look who has invested in New Zealand from overseas with a commitment to ongoing forest management. I think one particular who I haven't yet talked to is Graf von Westphalen. He invested a lot of money in the last few years, and when he came from Germany and from Austria, a colleague of his, when they came to purchase these thousands of hectares of farm and plantation land, they said it is okay to have radiata pine, but wouldn't it be nice to have 30 species instead? So I reckon there is a lot of potential, considering that Graf von Westphalen's family is involved in forestry for 700 years. And they are already belonging to the A&W, like myself, for over 30 years, the Association for Close to Nature Forest Management. So there's a lot of ground. This is economics. This is not just feel-good stuff. Let's look at it from an intergenerational point of view. And we have to optimize the solar panel in New Zealand and here in Tasmania and beyond. We have to really keep the solar panel, i.e. the productivity, continuously flowing. A start-stop scenario is inefficient in itself. You might have that chessboard methodology by clear felling one patch and replacing another. It will be interesting to hear next week or in a couple of weeks when we hear from New Zealand, from Austria and from Slovenia. They both have very different traditional methods of forestry. So I know that there is just a mountain ridge on the northern side in Austria. They have strip clear felling for centuries. Whereas on the southern side in Slovenia, they stopped clear felling in 1948. So it will be very interesting, especially due to the floods in the last 3 weeks, to compare then the New Zealand North Island situation with the Slovenian and then with the Austrian situation regarding landslip, debris, i.e. slash, what is actually going on, and so forth. So it's a very complex and wide-ranging issue. I'm very keen to listen, and I'm looking forward to have engagement with you over the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. I can see, Roger, you've got your hand up.
Oh, Derek, coming back to the Zoom. Yeah, cool. Yeah, great. Thanks, Ryan. Sorry, I hope you don't mind jumping in and kind of following up on Brad's comment. He's right. We can't plant our way out of this, but we also can't not. We've got ourselves in a real bind here, and just as a kind of a for instance of that, we look at decarbonising our transport, for instance. Even with projected growth in electric vehicles by 2030, I forget whether it's 2030 or 2040, we're still going to have 95% of our cars are going to be internal combustion. If we want to decarbonise those with biofuel, even replacing just 30% of liquid biofuel would need the equivalent of all the new forest that we've planted since 1995, 725,000 hectares. So he's right. We can't just plant our way out of this. And meeting our carbon budgets and actually getting to net zero is going to require some pretty fundamental change in the rest of the economy. And if I'm honest, I don't know whether New Zealand is up for that. We say we want a price on carbon emissions until it makes things cost more, and then we don't. So we've got ourselves in a real bind. I mean, luckily we've got forests and forestry. They are there to help, but they're not going to be part of the whole solution. And we know we need to have much more diverse kinds of forests managed in much more diverse ways than what we have. And if you're a forest scientist, like I used to be, this is kind of roll your sleeves up, rub your hands together and get into it. The future should be pretty rosy for forestry. But it's, as Brad said, it's not the only thing, and let's not forget that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Roger. Do we have anybody else who wants to make a comment? I can see Sean, your hand's up. Go for it, mate.
Thanks, Ramona. And yeah, thanks, Roger. I just wanted to reiterate what Roger has just said. I feel that the national debate on climate change has really been skewed into a very unfortunate place, partly because the emissions trading scheme was designed as a trading system, not a cap and trading system. And so there's never been a cap on participant emissions on the buy side of the emissions trading scheme. There's only been essentially an instruction to buy carbon from the forestry industry, which is exactly what's happened. And as a result of the design of the emissions trading scheme doing exactly what it was supposed to do, there's been a whole lot of investment in forestry, which demonstrates that when you incentivize sectors, they grow. What the government has failed to do from the beginning of the emissions trading scheme is create an environment that stimulates investment in clean technology and clean development and emissions reductions. And because of that, there's not a fire hose of money going into clean technology and clean development and transportation and urban infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. The trouble is, though, is now the government seems to be, and a lot of the public seem to be just blaming forestry for the problem, when it's just the design of the emissions trading scheme itself. And Roger's absolutely right. It's not an either or. We absolutely need, globally as well, not just in New Zealand. I mean, even emissions globally from human sources are about 20% of them are from things like deforestation and forest degradation. So like forests have always got to be part of the solution. And in New Zealand, it should be. But we can't blame the forest industry for the government not imposing constraints, genuine emissions reduction constraints on the fossil fuel sector. And so this is where, this is the basis of our submission on the NZETS review, was that we need to have caps on the demand side of the market so that then we can have a better balance between emission reductions and emissions removals. And I really appreciate hearing from Kit as well and reminding us that we've got experience in continuous cover forestry. We need to amplify this. And I think this is a pivot point, an opportunity for the country to move very strongly in this direction. And again, in our submission on the permanent forest category, I've tried to make it clear that it's really not an issue of what species, whether it should be natives versus exotics, which is, I think, a false dichotomy. It's really what kind of management regime we want the permanent forest category to have. And I'm going to write a letter to Santa asking him for a continuous cover, a permanent forest category that is synonymous with continuous cover forestry. And that's essentially, I think, what it should mean. And then we'll be able to create a fire hose of money towards continuous cover forestry from those in the emissions trading scheme that need to buy credits from the forest sector. And in the process, we'll end up healing landscapes that desperately need it. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Some really direct advice and getting to the nub and the pain points of this picture that we're trying to illustrate here, and this question that we're all posed with answering together. Is there anybody else that wants to have a word? We've got another 5 minutes. Lania, I just saw you pop up there. Is there anything you want to say? You can unmute yourself and
Oh, kia ora. No, sorry. I was just saying I really enjoyed all these presentations today. Some really interesting and relevant topics, and that was really succinctly done. I just had a thought in my head. No, I wasn't going to ask a question, but I was wondering what's the state of our, there were numbers put up around our land under forest, under native, and hearing Kit's view around these need to be existing natural capital and the appetite for opportunities within our existing standing estate under continuous cover as a start for exploring some of these new ideas around trying to bring in these other models of continuous cover. Is that the best place to start? But I didn't have a question. Sorry. I see G. Richards has his hand up though.
Yeah. I'll get to Geraint. Lania is a forest researcher from Scion and works on some of the steep land harvested areas. Geraint Richards from the Duchy of Cornwall, His Majesty's Forest Manager. Over to you.
Hi there, lovely to hear these messages, and so many of the same challenges as we're facing in the UK, actually. And this is an obvious point, and I'm sure I'll say more in the coming weeks. But growing healthy, resilient forests is a long-term business, and unfortunately, we live in a world that thinks, that behaves, that invests in the short term, the relative short term. And I think even the response to the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, I think some of these responses are very short-term in their thinking. Now, in some ways, necessarily so, because it is a crisis and we need to have rapid action. But I think we sometimes are, to use an expression we use in the UK, particularly when it comes to forest policy, we're seeing the tail wagging the dog. We're seeing this obsession with getting the fastest carbon sinks established that we can, that, maybe we'll deal with something 30, 40 years, but these are not necessarily forests that are going to be what I would call truly multifunctional and delivering the multiple benefits that we know we can do. And so certainly here, our desire, the King's desire is forests that are truly multifunctional, delivering the range of social, economic and environmental benefits that we know they can do. But that's a long-term business, and someone has to provide the income for you to do that. And sadly, the case in the UK and probably in New Zealand is most of the income that comes to the forest owner comes from timber, because no one's paying for these other benefits.
Fantastic. Some key themes coming through in these comments and conversations here. It seems that this short-term view doesn't seem to be assisting the business of climate mitigation, adaptation, and we need to be moving to some long-term thinking and decision making, which is great. I think we may have some and do we have the Menominee on the call still? Are they here this morning? I can't see them there.
Hi, did I hear Menominee?
Oh yes, go Michaeli. I was looking for you. Hi there.
Sorry, right at the tail end of the workday here.
What do you think of this?
Oh, sorry, I had people coming in and out of here bothering me with map requests, so I was only able to pay half as much attention as I'd like to, but I mean, as far as this goes, this was really informative. It's definitely, I don't want to say a lot different than what we do here, but it is a lot different from what we do here. And again, like I one of my main reasons for participating in this was to learn more, and this is so interesting to see how people are doing it across the world.
Yeah, nice to have your comment there, Michaeli. Thank you. I wonder, Sandra Velarde, is there anything that you wanted to say? Be interesting to hear from you. If you're still thinking about that invitation to speak, Sandra, Alec Giffen, I'll give you some time to talk. Ooh.
You need to unmute, Alec.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
There you go.
All right. So I live in the state of Maine, in the United States of America. I've been working at this kind of issue for 50 years now. I guess a couple of comments. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to participate in all of this, because I'm always interested in learning about the dilemma that people in other parts of the world are facing in terms of practicing good forestry. So thank you. I think we need to do more of this in more places around the world. Second thing is, I'm going to need a primer on what you guys are up against. I think you're making assumptions that I understand what your presenters are telling me, and I'm not sure that I do. So I'm going to need a reference to somebody who can spend some time with me and my boss, Bob Purcell, who's also participating, but I don't think is on this call. So I'd love to hear who we should be in touch with to maybe spend an hour on the phone.
Sure.
Third thing that I would say is that I sympathize with the situation that you're in, if I'm understanding it correctly, where there's no mechanism for paying for most of the ecosystem services that come from the forest. That's the situation that we've been up against here in New England and more broadly in the United States as well. But I feel like we really have turned a corner with the Biden administration, with the Inflation Reduction Act, and now they are putting large sums of money and a big emphasis on figuring out how we can produce climate smart commodities. And what that translates into, in our case, we got a $30 million grant to run a pilot project where what we're going to be doing is we're going to be paying landowners and loggers to practice climate smart forestry. And because we've been working at this for a while, we know what those practices are. We have to figure out how much to pay for them. And we have to figure out exactly what the greenhouse gas reductions are from those practices, individual and collectively. But I really feel like we've turned a corner and we have a chance to really revolutionize the practice of forestry, which, as one of your presenters said, is hampered by the interest, or we think of it as discount rates, that get applied to practicing good forestry. And up to this point, here in the state of Maine, people have known full well what they needed to do, but they haven't been able to afford it because the payoff is just too far in the future for it to pencil out for them. And I know that we're on the schedule later on in your presentations, and we're looking forward to sharing our story with you. And we're really enthused about the prospect of really changing the way that things get done as a result of the interest in reducing greenhouse gas levels.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alec, for chiming in and sharing your thoughts with us. Alec and his colleague Robert Purcell will be presenting on our fourth session, which is the week after next, and about their exemplary forestry options that they've been developing and researching in New England. Next week, we've got Professor Yuri Daci from Slovenia and Ljubljana University presenting to us about I guess the philosophy of close to nature type forestry, which is being carried on in the eastern part of Europe, and which is flowing out of these small nations, Slovenia, Austria, Switzerland, and other places like that. And we can relate strongly to that. On the same call with Alec and Robert Purcell, his colleague, will be our friends from Ireland who have a story similar to Aotearoa New Zealand in terms of their history and also their efforts to reforest their land after it was turned into farmland. So I'm going to bring our time to a close because we're now 5 minutes over. I want to thank everybody for your participation on this call. These calls are being recorded, so if you want to review some of what was discussed, either in the PowerPoint presentations or in the comments, you can do so. And we invite you back to be with us again at the same time here next Friday. Thank you all. Just hand some time over to you, Ernest, for closing karakia.
You need to unmute, Ernest.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your kororo. It was very interesting. Thank you, Justice, for stimulating us to get back on track, and the fact that we can work together. So that's exciting. Well, let's close in karakia for us. E pā te matua ko koe tēnei, e karapote nei e wainganui a tātou. E tohu ana ki a tātou, kia waihotunga mea taimaha, kia aroha te tahi, kia omangia te omanga i mua tō tātou aroro. No reira, tukuna mai te manakitanga i o runga i tātou, katoa. I tēnei taha te awa, i tērā taha te awa. Tukuna mai te manakitanga. I roto i te ingoa ihu kreiti tō tātou ariki. Amen.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day. Mā te wā.
Okay. Ka kete.